SJ. Welcome to Muscogee Radio, your weekly source for tribal and community news, interesting guests and discussions, plus a local events calendar. SJ, Stongo, Gary Fife, Jaho, Jeff Gados, Muscogee Radio, Mabo Hedgerowedskis. Day in a conversion of that holiday to an Indigenous Peoples Day, with a focus on our ancestors, our history, what actually transpired during the visit of Mr. Christopher Columbus and that sort of thing. A number of cities actually have been changing that, but we've also touched on the fact that Indigenous rights has become much more of a broader subject as we talk to our compatriots in other countries, particularly Central and South America, about their experiences and their struggles ongoing. But first of all, let's just start with the most basic question, I guess. How would you define Indigenous rights?
Indigenous rights are that bundle of legal rights that are of Indigenous peoples that are recognized in domestic and international law. And in the United States, the legal framework for defining Indigenous rights is a body of federal law known as Federal Indian Law, and it contains defines the legal rights of American Indian tribes, Alaska Natives, and to some degree Native Hawaiians, insofar as their political rights, their land rights, natural resource rights, self-government rights, political rights, cultural rights, human rights, those and treaty rights as well. The whole array of rights that pertain to Native Americans. And then on a larger scale, you have a international law, body of law in modern international human rights law in recent decades that have a growing part in a growing area, that rapidly expanding body of law that defines Indigenous human rights, which I think are best embodied in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that was passed by the UN General Assembly in the year 2007 and endorsed by the Obama administration in the year 2010. And that basically takes what we know as human rights from the general body of international treaties and customary norms and customary international law, and applies those existing norms and treaty provisions to Indigenous peoples to lay out a comprehensive human rights framework for Indigenous peoples that defines all of the rights that I just mentioned in federal Indian law, that is treaty rights, political rights, land rights, human cultural rights, and so on, as inherent human rights. And those come to us from international law. And
now let me jump in here. Now, when we say international law, and we're talking beyond the borders of the United States, we're including those tribes that remain, as I say, in Central and South America, and who have really begun flexing some muscle there, what muscle they have, and making their presence known. And of course, one of the countries down there actually has a native leader. So how does that kind of thing affect the average American Indian here, say in Oklahoma? It's not something, I guess, that's at the top of our minds, but what kind of bearing would those international struggles have on average folks, so to speak?
Yeah, I think it's very, very relevant to us here in Oklahoma because, as I mentioned, the Obama administration in the year 2010 endorsed this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that's along with about 150 other nations around the world. And those nations which have endorsed that declaration are embarking in various degrees in implementing these standards into their domestic laws and policies around the world. And so to me, that ushers in a brand new era, policy era in federal Indian law. And that is the human rights era of federal Indian law and policy. Back in the year 1970, when President Nixon announced the Indian self-determination policy to Congress, he back then ushered in the self-determination era of federal Indian law. And the challenge of the tribes, including the tribes in Oklahoma back in 1970, was to implement that policy across Indian country. And that became the work of two generations down to the present day to, in litigation, legislation, administrative policy changes. We now have worked to, within this Indian self-determination policy, to implement that across the land. And so now we come to the year 2010 with this human rights era that President Obama has ushered in. The challenge of our generation is to implement the human rights principle into our legal framework here. And so just like back in 1970, all of the tribal leaders, tribal attorneys lined up, and they began the work of two generations to implement self-determination. By the same token, in the current moment, our challenge is to work to implement these UN human rights standards into U.S. Indian law and policy. And so if we look at the progress of other countries in implementing those standards into domestic law and policy of other nations, it's in our interest to support that effort to ensure that as countries go about that process in our post-colonial world, that they don't water down the meaning of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and these inherent human right minimum standards that are laid out in there. And so whatever happens in other nations that affect, that have indigenous populations, I think could establish some precedents here at home as we begin to turn our attention to injecting the human rights principle into our domestic legal framework for defining our indigenous rights.
Now, let me ask you this one. Actually, two parts of this question. First of all, are we pretty much the only people on the planet that don't have a UN representative, someone sitting in that international body? And second, too often I think that the term human rights gets used fairly easily and sometimes gets glossed over. So how would you define human rights? So first of all, the first part of the question, are our people unrepresented?
Yes, as Russell Means said back in the late 70s, the UN has representatives from all of the other races, the white, black, yellow, and brown races, but not the red race. And today, we don't have any official membership in the UN, in the United Nations. We here in the Western Hemisphere, actually North and South America. However, within the last generation or since the late 1970s, our tribal peoples have got a seat at the table at the UN as an NGO status, and had worked elbow to elbow since the 1980s in crafting this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And they have a permanent forum for Indigenous peoples, and so it's very responsive, even though we have no voting capacity there as other nation states do that are member states. We do have access there and an ability to get a seat at the table. I personally am not familiar with that process. I have never been to the UN or worked in that forum, but I do know that it's increasingly accessible, and we owe that to a lot of our pioneers, our traditional people here in the U.S. that had gone to the UN time and time again, and sort of became pioneers in terms of getting tribal access to the international arena. And their work has brought home this landmark UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I think it's up to us in the domestic hinterland of Indian country to embrace that and work to implement those standards. It's a boon or a gift to us brought from the international realm that I think can strengthen our legal rights in the U.S. and make them more dependable in a more just body of law pertaining to Native Americans.
Okay, now the second part of that question, when we say human rights, do you have a list? Something come to mind? How could you define that, perhaps?
What are human rights? At first blush, think that these are alien sorts of things that come from international law or the UN, and but we don't realize that those kinds of rights are homegrown here in America. They're as American as apple pie. And in the Declaration of Independence, the founding fathers recognized that there's a category of rights that every human being enjoys that come to us from a higher source, that every human being enjoys in the societies, or should enjoy in the societies that they live in, just by virtue of being human.
Okay, and quickly, could you perhaps pick out a few for me, and then just give me a
right
list?
To life, liberty, right to own property, right to not be protected, to be protected against slavery, no piracy rights, right to no genocide. Modern international law has a whole bunch of human rights: the right to self-determination, the right to culture, the right to own property, the right to have your parental rights over their children, right to indigenous. There's a whole broad array of them, and it's a continuing, growing body of rights. And in fact, Gary, just about every right known in federal Indian law, treaty rights, self-government rights, the rights to indigenous institutions, property, the right to culture, so on and so forth, are deemed in modern international human rights law as an inherent human right. That is, and these are rights are very, these are the kinds of rights, Gary, that according to our forefathers and our human rights legacy in the U.S. are larger than a nation. They're the kind of rights that no nation can take away. They're inalienable rights. They're indefeasible rights. They're the kind of rights that democratic nations were formed to protect. And if we are able to move and redefine or reconceptualize our Native American rights into these kinds of rights, we will find that we're on much stronger foundation, because that means that Congress can't take them away. And its plenary power cannot terminate our tribes or take away our self-government or break our treaties with impunity.
Now, let me jump in again here. This is just too intriguing for me to pass up. Now, we've seen in an increasingly conservative U.S. Supreme Court that they've ruled against many cases involving Native Americans and rights, and many of the things that you just delineated. Of course, the latest being saying Jim Thorpe has to stay in Pennsylvania. First of all, would you agree with that quickly? And let's move on to your book here that just fascinates me. In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 worst Indian law cases ever decided. We'll pick out a couple of those. But first of all, the first part of that question, would you agree I guess the High Court is becoming a bit more hostile toward our cases?
Yes, I think it's generated, I think, a legal crisis in my mind since the advent of the Rehnquist Court in the mid-'80s to the present date. Our Indian nations have lost over 80% of our cases that go before that court, and in some terms losing 88% of the cases. And so that's led many of our leading legal scholars and tribal leaders to worry, is federal Indian law dead? And it's a fairly frightening prospect to have the High Court on a definite judicial trend towards trimming back on our hard-won Native American rights,
At this point,
yes, I do agree with that.
Okay, forgive me for stepping on you there, but I think it's important to remind our listeners here that our people are the only ones in this nation that have a legally binding relationship with the federal government. In other words, there is no Bureau of African American Affairs or Bureau of Asian Affairs, but by golly, there is a Bureau of Indian Affairs, which embodies that political relationship. And I say political and not racial. And a lot of people, even here in Oklahoma, still have that misconception. So that's the basis for our relationship.
That's true. We have a unique legal status due to the indigenous nature of our Indian tribes. We were here first, and then we formulated a treaty relationship between the tribes and the United States government, and therefore are the only segment of the American population that has formal a treaty relationship with the United States. And in fact, our tribes came into the Union through our treaties under the protection of the United States government with our self-government rights. And those, as you mentioned, Gary, are in fact political rights. They're not based on race, but upon a political status of our Indian nations that are signatories to these treaties and Indian people who are members of federally recognized tribes. And that's a political relationship that's been recognized by the Supreme Court for 150 years,
Right. You make treaties between nations and not races.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Well, let's. We've got the High Court on our mind now. In was it 2010? You had a book come out in the courts of the conqueror, the 10 worst Indian law cases ever decided. Whew, how did you stop at 10? Okay, well let's take a look at that list in the time we've got for this segment here. Number one, what's the absolutely the worst case that comes to your mind?
Johnson v. McIntosh. This was a case decided by the Supreme Court in the year 1823. John Marshall's court. He was the Chief Justice and probably the leading Chief Justice of all time. He defined the contours of the Constitution and put flesh on it, and basically the definer of our nation. And was kind of like Elvis, I guess. He was the king. He's the greatest of our Chief Justices. But in 1823, this case came before the Supreme Court. It was the first one to come before the Supreme Court raising any kind of a substantive issue at all. And it was defining the land rights of our Indian tribes, our land ownership rights. And he basically, in a nutshell, held that he incorporated the early international law doctrine of discovery, and also utilized notions of conquest, and ruled that the act of discovery by European sailors off the coast of North America, by seeing that coastline, that act operated to transfer legal title to the land from Indian tribes to, in our instance, the King of England, and then on to the United States as the successor in interest. And so that opinion basically holds, by virtue of this doctrine of discovery, that the Indian tribes lost the legal title to their land and only retained a, quote, right of occupancy, which could be terminated by the government either through purchase or conquest. And then he went on to hold that the act of discovery also meant that the continent was conquered, that the tribes had been conquered through this act of discovery. And so the opinion is peppered with racially derogatory descriptions of Indians as racially inferior, with racially inferior characters, cultures, and religions. Certainly none of those findings that the court made were true, that we're not racially inferior, we don't have inferior religions. And it was also untrue that when discovering the continent, that we ceded any legal title to the government. There were no bill of sales, there were no land conveyances, and furthermore, we were not conquered either. Right.
We could live here, but they owned the land, right?
Yeah, and so those were legal fictions that sometimes are employed by the courts. Usually the court bases the ruling on facts and evidence that are proven and admitted into evidence. But once in a great while, a court will employ what is known as a legal fiction to reach a desired result, usually a just result. And that would be that say, in the instance of a fraud, I defraud you out of property. Well, the court will say, well, Walter, you defrauded Gary, and therefore I'm going to determine that you hold his property in a constructive trust for Gary. And they were wanting to reach a just result here by using that legal fiction, even though we didn't do a trust document. There's no trust document out there. And that's called a legal fiction, and they're usually employed by the courts in rare instances to reach a desired, usually just result. In Johnson v. McIntosh, absurd legal fictions were reached for an unjust result to deprive the Indians of their land ownership. And as a result of that far-reaching opinion, tribes went from landowners to mere tenants of the government.
Okay, now let me, only in a couple of minutes we have left, let me move on to another one when we're talking about land ownership and things like that. Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, it comes to mind there.
Yeah, that is another of the 10 worst cases that I listed there, where the state of Georgia employed the law to harass and intimidate the Cherokee Nation and drive it from Georgia, and enacted a number of Georgia statutes of anti-Indian statutes to take away their land, void their contracts, prohibit Cherokees from testifying in court, banning their government, banning the tribal courts, basically conducting a war in disguise on the Cherokee Nation and misusing the law to harass and intimidate for the purpose of driving an Indian nation out of the state. And that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to review the case. They said, we don't have jurisdiction here because the issue was, what is the status of the Cherokee Nation to sue a state of the Union? And they appeared in court as a foreign nation. The Cherokee Nation said, we are a foreign nation suing a state. Therefore, you have original jurisdiction in the U.S. Supreme Court there's a particular clause that says Supreme Court can hear cases originally brought by a foreign nation against one of our states. And so the state said, no, the Cherokee Nation is not a foreign nation, even though 3 or 4 of the justices would have ruled that they were in fact a foreign nation. They said, no, it's a domestic dependent nation that is in a state of wardship to the United States. And basically that opinion and some of the concurring opinions in that case rested on very racially tirade against Indians and sort of fanned the flames of the removal movement. And so later, 1 year later, the Supreme Court reversed itself in Worcester v. Georgia, but by then it was too late to do anything. President Andrew Jackson at that time said, well, John Marshall made his decision, let him enforce it.
Yeah, send in the Supreme Court Army, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Walter Ekohaka, we've just run out of time here. I just want to thank you so much for shedding some light on some of these complications, and I know we're going to want to talk to you again. Let's project into the future there. What do you see on the horizons? Is there any danger signs or something, any cases that come to mind there? But we'll save that for another program. Once again, thank you so much for speaking with me. We appreciate you helping us out here and kind of laying some of this stuff out.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Okay. We'll talk to you again. All right. We're going to take a short pause here, and we'll be back with our friend Sean Partridge talking about the domestic violence campaign, some of the events going on during this observance of the month. And we have planned Jessica McBride joining us in here as a participant in one of their workshops and maybe talking about it as a reporter. So please stay with us.
Hear that? That's the sound of Hope being killed by meth. Methamphetamine use is causing huge problems in our community. Hear that? That's the sound of something you can do about it. Events like rodeo, res ball, and family time can help keep kids away from meth.
Talk to your kids. Keep our culture alive. A message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
Learn more at ncai.org.
Who am I? Am I Native? I don't want people assuming things because I'm Indian. I just want to be me. But how do I live in 2 worlds? Some guys just check out by doing meth. But that ain't for me. Because I see my family, my friends, my drum making, my future. There are a lot of cool things about being who I am. and meth isn't one of them.
Learn more at ncai.org. A message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
Welcome back to Muscogee Radio here on 1240 The Brew. Kale, and beautiful downtown Okmulgee here today. Gosh, it's nice. We have a minor change in our lineup here. We're going to be speaking with Tania Jessica McBride. Oh, thanks for melting the earwax there, Stan. Tania Bardin and Jessica McBride from our own Muscogee media. Gosh, I got me so Oh, well, Jessica, what's her name's here? Anyway, we're looking at Domestic Violence Month observances across the nation, and we wanted to focus in here on the kind of things that are happening within the Muscogee Creek Nation. It's a subject we've talked about so many times before, but I guarantee you, folks, we're going to keep hammering until we get some changes happening. And first of all, Tania, welcome to the program. Let me start with you and ask you about those changes. Are you seeing anything, or what's coming in the door at your office? What are you hearing on the phone?
Sure. Thank you for having me. First off, domestic violence is an epidemic right now within our country, and sadly among our Native people. But due to the awareness and outreach activities that we've had, we are seeing more victims receive services. I think they're coming forward feeling more confident in the services they're receiving through our program, but there's still a lot of work to do. Unfortunately, our offenders aren't being held accountable. So.
Oh, that's a tough one, but it does sound like there is progress in victims being perhaps what's comfortable, I guess, in coming to bring that case and that story and see about getting something done.
Absolutely. I think learning about our program, hearing about the services we provide, and understanding that they're confidential, completely voluntary, has helped victims feel comfortable maybe in coming forward. It's not that the services haven't been there, but maybe we haven't done our part in the awareness and outreach, and over the last few years we have, and we have seen those numbers quadruple. So, which again, we don't take that as a negative, we take that as a positive because the victimization was occurring. It's just now that those, they have a voice and they know that there's someone who cares and that, they can receive services.
Right, it's not as hidden as it once was.
Absolutely.
And we also want to thank Sean for being in here, giving some backup, some spiritual backup there. Now, while we've got you here on the spot, so to speak, does our tribe have any numbers, perhaps, that could define the situation?
As far as statistically, I mean, sadly, again, Native American people have the highest rates of victimization. We don't really know exactly why. I mean, we do look, to colonization and different things like that, but we don't actually have the answer. We just know that sadly our women have the highest rates. 1 in 4 women, will be a victim in their lifetime. Sexual assault, we have the highest rates there. And again, we've actually already this year probably provided assistance to over 200 victims. Oh. Now, that's not all Native Americans. We provide services to victims of all races. Mm-hmm. But absolutely.
Right, when you're a victim there, it doesn't matter what race you are.
Absolutely.
We've seen these statistics, and it goes just beyond the physical battering, if you will, or emotional abuse and things like that to affect an entire family. So we're talking, kids and relatives and things like that in these relationships. And one of the sad outcomes is that many of these mothers would be losing children. Is that the case?
Losing them through maybe DHS or through murdered, homicide, suicide?
Well, I don't know. You could perhaps help us define that.
Yeah.
I know. Thanks for putting you on the spot again.
No, that's okay. Unfortunately, it is true. We do see victims. There's just a lot of victim blaming. In fact, that's kind of what our simulation that this year for Domestic Violence Awareness Month, we are doing the In Her Shoes simulation, and it's to help educate people on, victims don't choose to stay in abusive relationships, and we kind of have that warped in our society to think that there's as if this choice, like when I wake up and I put on a black shirt versus a blue, that's a choice. A victim you don't choose to be a victim. You know, there's fear, there's an intimidation, there's somebody who's literally, you know, overpower and control. That's what it's about, and there's a perpetrator who's doing that. So a lot of times victims can lose their children to DHS, and I'm not saying they don't have a job to do. Absolutely, children deserve to be protected and not abused, but oftentimes we blame the victim for that abuse versus helping that victim, providing them a safe way and an opportunity to leave that situation. We actually come in and just remove their kids, saying you failed to protect them, when in reality, throughout that relationship, they were doing everything they could to protect the children.
Now, you mentioned simulation there. Is this a new technique, something that you've added to your agenda? And then we'll move on to Jessica here, who actually went through that process.
Sure. Me and another staff member had an opportunity to participate in a simulation ourselves, and we had purchased the In Her Shoes and just had not used it as an awareness outreach. And talking about this year that we still are seeing so much victim blaming, that the In Her Shoes simulation was an opportunity to let people walk in a victim's shoes. Their stories are based off real life experiences of women with abusive partners. So they take on that character and they kind of walk through that experience and understand the struggles and the difficulties that someone faces in even trying to leave. And then the other thing is that Oklahoma is ranked third in the nation for domestic violence homicides.
Sure.
And so when you say, why doesn't she leave? I mean, you need to understand it's not that easy. It's not that simple. And we need to start looking at, why does he batter? You know, and what can we do to help stop that?
What actually happens during that simulation?
Sure. So we break it up into groups. There are 7 characters, and they're given a character card. And there are a total of 17 stations. They consist of like a shelter, home, forgive and forget, a clinic or ER, job, just different things that in real life trying to leave that they're going to need or they're going to face. And so they actually read a character card, and it leads them to a station, and then throughout they get to make choices to kind of which station they'll go to next, and each station will lead them to ultimately the scenario will end of several different ways. Unfortunately, some victims lose their life, which is a reality. Some victims are able to leave that situation and continue with their lives. So the outcomes are different depending on the character, again, based on real life.
Jessica, now you participated. I'm curious about, you know, you as a woman, what you went through, and also as a reporter. So first of all, what character were you?
I got assigned Lucy, who was an immigrant from Vietnam. She came to the United States when she was 16 years old and married an American man who she fell in love with. And it drastically changed after that. Our character card sent us to the abuse station, and she was criticized by her husband for flirting with the plumber, and that's kind of where the abuse started. What was really eye-opening for me is as I followed her journey and actually made choices for her, you know, whether to seek out an advocate, whether to seek counseling through the clergy or family or friends, was that those decisions, as Tania have said, aren't always easy. You know, we'd like to think that the individuals that are in these domestic violence situations, that it's just call an advocate and get out, go to the shelter, you know, or go to a friend's house, and that's not always the case. You know, on my character card, I called an advocate, and she basically ran me through 100 different things that I could do, and then said good luck, and it was kind of up to me to kind of figure it out. And then I called the shelter, and you know, the shelter was full for the night, and so where else was I to go except to go back home with my children into an abusive situation? And I think instances like that is something that individuals that are outside of domestic violence situations don't understand.
That's the critical point, I think, is this is why. And these were realistic situations. I noticed or program people nodding in agreement there, but this is what these women are facing, really. So that's why you stay with them, or some of the reasons, right?
Exactly, and it's you know, some of the choices were, okay, do you go back home, forgive him, or do you call an advocate, or do you go to family? And you never know what exactly that situation is going to be, and what exactly the cards hold. Sometimes it's not always going to play out in your favor, just like the shelter being closed and having to go back home. You know, you don't know, you can't control that situation.
I'm just saying, the reality of those options is terrifying. I think it's like, me as a guy, I obviously didn't understand many of those and hadn't even thought of them. But this was, how would you describe the overall experience?
Eye-opening, and I know that sounds a little bit cliche, but it really was. You know, we find ourselves that we're very critical of these women for going back to these men, and it's not always that they want to go back. Sometimes it's like Tania explained yesterday, it's going through the process. There's a court process you have to go through, and all of these things, you know, to get into a shelter or to get into temporary housing where you can have your kids with you, or to even get your children back from CPS. You know, it's a process, and it takes time, and sometimes time doesn't work into your favor.
Now, Tania, let me ask you, these sound like some horrifying scenarios that people will have to deal with, but obviously they're the real thing. This is what folks go through. Is it hard to, first of all, do this, and second, is it difficult to get people to participate and kind of walk through something they already know?
Actually, I thought, to be honest, when we decided to do the simulation, I didn't think we'd have as many people sign up. I didn't know if people would be as interested, because it wasn't going to be something where we just sit back and we educate you. Mm-hmm. You're going to be educated through an experience, through a process. But we've had an overwhelming number of calls. We actually they were full. Our simulation, all sessions were full within a very short period of time, and we're looking at holding another in November. So again, we were surprised, and I think it shows that people do want to understand. People want to be educated. It's tough as far as for us to constantly be hitting those same walls, because we see sometimes through a victim's eyes, like she said, that a shelter is full. And I mean, reality, who wants to go to a shelter? Mm-hmm. Who wants to leave your home? And then if you do want to go to a shelter, they're full, or you have to go an hour away. What about your job? There's all these things that, like you said, we take for granted when we say the words, why don't you just leave? Mm-hmm. And again, that simulation puts it into a perspective that my words can't, because you're kind of going to get to experience that. Was it,
well, obviously it was a grueling session. Did you have cases where people just couldn't take it and had to leave?
We provide what we call the safe area, because again, it can be emotional. If someone has ever experienced this or had family members who have been through domestic violence, it can evoke emotion, bring back those feelings, the fear, and so we encourage participants, if they start feeling uncomfortable or like they can no longer take it or they don't want to continue, we have a safe area. They can speak to advocates. We don't ever pressure. It's not a force to complete the simulation. They're encouraged to take care of themselves first and foremost. We had people become emotional. I think I only did see one woman who felt she needed to step aside to take a breather, and again, that's encouraged. We want that. We're not trying to make this challenging. It's just real, and it can be very difficult.
What about the positive side? Did you have participants who came out with a much deeper understanding of everything and more of a commitment or an ability perhaps to deal and take that next step? I mean, positive results?
Absolutely. We actually had an evaluation. Sean had created an evaluation that everyone would complete. It's anonymous. We don't need to know your name. And overwhelmingly, everyone said how much they enjoyed it and how, just like Jessica, it opened their eyes. It's not, people don't know. If you've never experienced this, you've never had a family member, we make assumptions about what it is or what it would be like to be in those shoes. So it really, all the feedback we received was very positive, and they just encourage us to continue to bring this to their communities.
All right, now let's really shift gears here and ask Jessica to slip into her reporter role. What did you see when you went in there? Was there something you were looking for? How did it strike you? And perhaps keeping in mind that you were wanting to write an article or something about it, what went through your mind?
Well, to be honest, I tried not to have much of a plan when I went in there, because I wanted it to be a true experience and not have anyone influence it in any way. And so I wasn't really sure what to expect. I knew it would be kind of scenario based, but I didn't really expect how it was, picking a character and following that character and actually getting to make choices for that character. And I went in and volunteered, to be the victim, and the rest of the people that were in my group were my shadows. And I think at the point that I really realized what I was going to write about was each time we had to go to the abuse table, we put on a Band-Aid. And it kind of takes a toll on you emotionally to put on Band-Aid after Band-Aid after, you're trying to make good choices. I went to the advocate, and I'm trying to go through the court system, and, nothing is just going. And my character didn't have a job or a formal education. And, of course, that makes it even more difficult because you have to add job and finding a house and everything on top of that. Just to get out of the situation, that doesn't have any effect on afterwards whether, she files for divorce or not. So knowing that in the story that I'm writing, and I'm actually almost finished today, so if you're listening, you can look for it on our Facebook page, on the Muscogee Nation News Facebook page, or in the November 1st edition of the Muscogee Nation News. And it's really going to hone in on Lucy's story and me being in her shoes as a domestic violence victim.
So it sounds like that will be the critical point of your story, the main theme. What can people expect, I guess, when they pick up the paper and or get on the website and start reading your piece?
I'd like the reader to be able to hear Lucy's story. It's based upon true events, yes, but I did make some choices. And is it, a real story? Not necessarily, but it has real scenarios involved in it. And what I want the reader to do is to kind of take the journey that I did, even though they weren't there with me that day. I want them to see Lucy's story and how it played out and how the decisions I made, affected her.
Okay. Well, we'll be looking forward to reading that and seeing what kind of outcome there is. And we won't go into that. We'll let the readers discover that for themselves.
Exactly.
Tania, what else is lined up for the rest of the month? What other kind of activities or things do you all have planned?
Thanks. October 27th will actually, the simulation will take place 3 more times. On October the 30th is Purple Out, so we're encouraging everyone to wear purple as an awareness tool to domestic violence. Now, obviously, if you're going to wear purple, be prepared to kind of talk about that it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we're trying to bring awareness and encourage people to take a stand against that.
Sean, please jump in. I know you're just dying to share something.
Yes, well, I'm excited, Gary, and obviously very loud about it. Sorry for that.
Committed.
Cleaned up that earwax for all of you. But no, actually, this Friday, kind of a spur-of-the-moment activity that we have, but we're very excited to be hosting Sarah Deer at the College of the Muscogee Nation. She's a tribal citizen, an attorney, law professor, long history working in the field of advocacy. She most recently was selected as a MacArthur Fellow a year ago, and she's been a tremendous mentor for our program, and so we're hosting just a really kind of an informal meet and greet this Friday at the College of Muscogee Nation, 10 to 11:30, and so we invite people to come out. She's going to talk about her book. She's going to be inducted into the Muscogee Hall of Fame this weekend, so we're happy to have her in town and be able to highlight her work and her amazing contributions.
We had the pleasure of chatting with her on our show last week, and fascinating woman. She said she's still uncomfortable with being a genius. Anyway, okay, well, this is what we're looking forward to, and as I say to you and to our listeners, this is one subject we're going to keep hammering on. We're not going to let it go. So expect more in the future. Hopefully someday we'll have some delightful news to share with you. So
yes, we appreciate all of your support too, and helping us to highlight these issues and our efforts and the available services and the role that everybody plays in combating domestic and sexual violence. So Mado.
And if someone wanted to call for help,
yes, they can contact our office at 918-732-7979. We always rotate an on-call schedule, so even if it's after 8 to 5, which happens a lot, our on-call advocate can be reached via Lighthorse Police, 732-7800. It doesn't mean if they're contacting Lighthorse that they have to make a police report or anything.
Right.
They just simply patch the individual through to the on-call advocate.
Okay, you're doing wonderful work, and we wish the best for you, and keep going. We'll be there behind you.
Mado.
All right, well, we've got a few minutes left. Let's jump into some of our community news and announcements. This is also National Depression Awareness Month, a delightful subject. You can actually test your mood if you're feeling sad, anxious, or irritable. They have sessions coming up. Let's see, the next one will be at the Okemah Indian Center on the 15th and 16th in Okemah. Screenings run from 9:30 to 3:30 p.m. And for more information, get a hold of the folks at Behavioral Health Services, 918-758-1930.
Another reminder that Sarah Deer will be at the College of the Muscogee Nation at 10 a.m. on October 16th in honor of Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which is October. For more information on this event, call 918-732-7979.
And on a much lighter subject, Movies in the Dome coming up on October 22nd at 6:30. We're going to have the opportunity to see Monsters, Inc. There's free admission and concessions are available if you get the munchies at the Muscogee Dome. Once again, that's on the 22nd at 6:30.
The annual Council Oak ceremony will be at 2 p.m. October 24th at the Creek Nation Council Oak Park in Tulsa. After the event, everyone's invited out to the Tulsa Creek Indian community for activities.
And there is the 13th annual Pink Party coming up for breast cancer awareness, sponsored by the Muscogee Creek Nation Department of Health. That is Wednesday, October the 28th from 1 to 4 at the Muscogee Creek Nation Dome. For more information, 918-756-4300, extension 281.
The creator of Super Indian, Aragon Starr, will be there for a book signing at the Creek Council House on Tuesday, October 27th at 5 p.m. Light refreshments will be provided. For more information, call the Cultural Center and Archives Department at 918-549-2434.
And holiday season is quickly coming up on us. I'm sure you've seen stores now with their holiday decorations out. But the angel tree is also coming back. It'll be going up on November 2nd. This is your opportunity to help someone who is less fortunate and might not have the holiday that you will. The angels can be picked up at that time on the 2nd and due back on December 1st, 2015. Please, gifts returned unwrapped, so they can take care of that. Get a hold of Becky Baker, 918-732-7869.
The Vietnam Veterans Honor Powwow will be hosted on November 7th in Dallas, Texas. If you're interested in going or just want more information, call 405-227-3514.
Just don't wear your OU Sooner shirt there. Autism and Sensory Process Training Part 2 is coming up on the 9th of November from 1 to 4, again at the Tribal Mound Building. Our guest speaker is Wendy Van. The training will cover a sensory process refresher from the first training activities and brushing technique. So if you're interested, please register and give them a call at 918-224-9307.
If you're interested in art, music, food, sports, or children's activities, the Indian Fall Festival will be held on November 14th at 10 a.m. here at the Muscogee Dome in Okmulgee. It doesn't have contact information for that, but I know it's the Tourism and Recreation Department, so if you call the main Creek Nation phone number, you can get some information there.
Hey, Brian, you forgot the phone number. Okay, and our last announcement in our folder, and it's a good one, the Indian Fry Bread Cook-Off is coming up on Saturday, November the 14th at 1 p.m. Once again, at the Claude Cox Omniplex. There's a lot of rules involved there, so you might want to check with those when you want to enter. There is a $1,000 grand prize. Oh boy, and plus you get to eat cool fried bread. Let me see where we are. 918-752-8750 is the contact number, so give them a call if you want to see how your fried bread stacks up against other folks. Once again, we want to thank our wonderful people from the Family Violence Program for stopping in and talking about it, this incredible simulation that you had. And we're looking forward to seeing Jessica's article. Okay, now, all right, that wraps us up. We're out of ammo here, but we still have a couple of minutes, so this is where we get to ad-lib a little bit and talk about something fun. Now, Jessica, we've had some incredible changes for our department with the National Council passing and the Principal Chief signing our Freedom of the Press Act. For me, it gives us just a wonderful tool to work with. Finally, being able to answer a lot of the questions that our citizens have been asking of us. And we just, let's just say it, we were unable to do at the time. But now we have this wonderful opportunity to really fulfill our jobs as professionals in an ethical, fair, and balanced manner. What are your thoughts there?
I think it's an exciting time at the Muscogee Creek Nation, Gary. I think it's exciting for us, for citizens, for the nation as a whole, and I look forward to being able to report to the citizens what's going on in the nation and answering citizens' questions.
I think it's important for us to also say that we're not going out on headhunting. We're not going out on some kind of vendetta or anything like this. Something comes up that we feel needs coverage, then we're going to approach it in a fair and balanced manner and give the most accurate information we can to our citizens and let them decide, make up their own mind.
Exactly. We as the press are neutral, and it's the citizens' decision. We'll just present you both sides of the story.
Well, we're looking forward to that and showing our folks exactly what we can do.
Yes, sir.
I feel good about it. I mean, I just can't get over that. Anyway, that's enough of our ramblings here. We just want to say, Mado Mabuhedjit Scut, Mvskoke Radio. You've been listening to Muscogee Radio. Join us again next week for more local, tribal, and community news and updates. Mado.